Welcome everyone to session 3 of the Cancer and Environment Forum 2022. This forum is sponsored by a unique combination of distinguished cancer care and environmental science institutions: Dana-Farber Cancer Institute, Silent Spring Institute, Lowell Center for Sustainable Production, the Zhu Family Center for Global Cancer Prevention, Cancer-Free Economy Network, Mass General Brigham, and the Center for Cancer Equity and Engagement of the Dana-Farber Harvard Cancer Center. I'm Julia Brody. I'm the Executive Director and a Senior Scientist at Silent Spring Institute. As someone who has been studying the links between chemicals and breast cancer for more than 20 years, I'm delighted to be here to moderate today's session, which is focused on primary prevention and a role for healthcare providers as trusted communicators. I'll introduce our speakers and panelists, and after their presentations and moderated discussion, I'll open the floor for your questions. If you would like to ask a question, please type it into the Q&A at the bottom of your Zoom screen at any time. We'll answer as many questions as time allows. To set the context, a few weeks ago, President Biden announced the relaunch of the Cancer Moonshot with the goal to reduce cancer deaths by half. This session is about the potential to reduce cancer deaths by reducing cancer incidence. Primary prevention happens before mammograms or colonoscopy or other screening methods that are designed to detect cancers that are treatable. Primary prevention is about people not getting cancer in the first place. In session 2, we heard about cancers that are prevented by the Clean Air Act and other policies that reduce air pollution. In this session, we circle back to session 1 for a broader look at prevention, including common sense approaches to chemicals that manifest the characteristics of carcinogens described by Dr. Kate Guyton. Dr. Guyton spoke about multiple streams of evidence, including experimental studies in animals and cells and observational epidemiology, used by the International Agency for Research on Cancer to classify chemicals as known, probable, or possible carcinogens. She told us about carcinogens that act via multiple biological pathways, including damage to DNA, hormone disruption, suppressed immune function, and other processes. Chemicals like these, chemicals with these characteristics are ubiquitous in everyday environments. For instance, personal care products, cleaners, and plastics often contain ingredients that mimic estrogen, a known breast cancer risk factor. Another example, PFAS are a family of chemicals in stain repellent and water-resistant textiles and food packaging, and a common contaminant in drinking water. They have multiple characteristics of carcinogens and are associated with kidney and testicular cancers. At this point, expert panels, including the President's Cancer Panel, the American College of Obstetrics and Gynecology, Endocrine Society, and an Institute of Medicine panel, have concluded that we should act on what we know, for example, from the IARC assessments, while we pursue further research to better understand the risks. Healthcare providers can help by supporting their patients' interest in healthy living and sharing with them some of the many science-based resources that are available today on how to reduce harmful exposures. As you listen to our speakers, it's critical to remember that when chemicals are ubiquitous, they can pose significant public health risks, even if the incremental risk to an individual is relatively low or moderate. You can see this from the example of the Women's Health Initiative. In this study of 27,000 women, a randomly selected group, age 60 and older, received treatment with estrogen, progesterone, hormone replacement therapy, a treatment that was standard at the time. The hypothesis was that the combination hormones would have benefits for cardiovascular health that would outweigh the expected increase in breast cancers. But the results were a surprise. Overall risks outweighed the benefits. Many women went off the drugs and breast cancer incidence went down. In the 20 years since then, an estimated 250,000 women have been saved from getting breast cancer by changes in clinical practice driven by this study. For an individual, the average increase in breast cancer risk from taking combination HRT is about 25 to 55%. And this risk may seem moderate, but at the population level, it represents a large opportunity for cancer prevention. This example is directly relevant to our conversation today because in this session, we'll hear about common chemicals that stimulate these same hormones, estrogen and progesterone. We'll hear how industry is blocking action to reduce exposures, and we'll talk about how healthcare providers can integrate conversations about everyday chemicals into patient care and your trusted role in your community. A few thoughts about risk communication from my own experience in exposure science. My research involves communicating with study participants about chemicals detected in their blood, urine, or household dust, air, or tap water. It's not comfortable to tell people their blood contained a chemical we're studying for effects on cancer. I don't want them to be overly anxious or to worry about the wrong things, so I understand the impulse to reassure. But after hundreds of interviews with people after they received their chemical exposure results, I know that false reassurance is not what people want. That's why the National Academies of Sciences consensus statement recommends sharing results, even when the science is uncertain. People want you to tell them what you know and what you don't know. They don't want you to say there's no proof when the chemical hasn't been studied, or you know it causes cancers in animals, but it hasn't been studied in humans. Transparency about these realities builds trust and enables people to act on their own values. Doctors and nurses are already experienced at sharing bad news and helping people accommodate uncertainty. And I hope this session will give you new ways of thinking about primary prevention and applying your skills in constructive conversations about reducing risks. And to take this conversation forward, I am delighted to introduce our first speaker, Dr. Margaret Kripke. Dr. Kripke is Professor Emeritus and founding chair of the Department of Immunology at the University of Texas MD Anderson Cancer Center, where she also served as Executive Vice President and Chief Academic Officer. Her research on skin cancer opened the field of photoimmunology after she showed that immune alterations from UV radiation contribute to the development of melanoma. Dr. Kripke served multiple terms on the President's Cancer Panel, which oversees the National Cancer Program, and she contributed to its path-breaking report, Reducing Environmental Cancer Risk. Dr. Kripke.
Thank you, Julie, for that nice introduction. In my experience, the attitude of most clinicians and cancer researchers is that environmental causes of cancer are really not very important. First of all, not many people are affected. Second, the evidence is weak or at best controversial and contradictory. And third, you can't do much about it, so why should we worry about it? Well, that certainly was my attitude in the days when I was a cancer researcher. I was really skeptical about the importance of this issue. After all, epidemiologists have been telling us for years that only around 6% of human cancers were attributed to environmental factors. Well, my outlook on this subject changed very dramatically about 12 years ago when I was a member of the President's Cancer Panel. And during this time, we carried out a year-long study of the subject and produced a report that was entitled Reducing Environmental Cancer Risk. And what I learned from this exercise was absolutely shocking to me. I went into this study with a number of very commonly held assumptions. First one was that chemicals that are put on the market would be tested before they're put on the market. Second, that chemicals known to be harmful would be regulated or not put on the market. And third, the regulations, if they existed, would be enforced. Well, it turns out that none of these assumptions is actually entirely true. First of all, there is about 80,000 chemicals in the marketplace today. There are more every year. and many are produced in millions of pounds per year. Hardly any of these is actually tested for their cancer-causing ability. The reason for that is that we in this country operate on the basis of something called the reactionary principle for chemical production. And that reactionary principle says if it causes harm, then we regulate it or remove it from the marketplace. And it's considered safe until proven otherwise. Other countries use what's called the precautionary principle, which means that manufacturers have to demonstrate safety before a chemical is released for use by the public. And if it's harmful, the manufacturers bear some responsibility. And of course, this provides lots of incentives to make safe chemicals and to use manufacturing processes that don't generate a lot of toxic byproducts. We don't have those incentives in this country. It's also not true that chemicals known to be harmful are regulated. The International Agency for Research on Cancer, as Julie just mentioned, studies chemicals in common use and applies various criteria to classify them as carcinogenic in humans, probable carcinogens, possible carcinogens, and so on. Many of these chemicals in common use in our country are classified as carcinogens or probable carcinogens by the IARC. And they are unregulated in this country, even though many of them are banned in other industrialized countries. And finally, for the few chemicals that we do regulate, the regulations are often impossible to enforce. So what are the consequences of our approach to chemical safety? The most obvious one is that we live in an ocean of chemicals. When I think about what my life was like growing up, and I won't tell you how old I am, but the difference is really very astonishing. There were few cleaning products. We did not have an exterminator. My mother used very few cosmetics. There was no static guard, no fragrances and things, no flame retardants, no nonstick pans, no styrofoam, no food additives. And now we have all those things. In fact, you can't turn on the TV these days without seeing at least 4 advertisements for products to clean your air, your furniture, your socks, and even your body parts. So I had to wonder, what is the impact of all of these chemicals on human health? Why is it that the incidence of childhood cancer and birth defects has been increasing over the past 5 decades? Why is puberty in children occurring at progressively earlier ages? Why is it that the epidemic of breast cancer has 80% of the women affected who have no family history of the disease? And why is it that some cancers are continuing to occur at progressively earlier ages in adults? Could this be related to some of the chemicals that are in our environment? In the years since the President's Cancer Panel report, excuse me, we have learned a lot, both about how cancers develop and the role of chemicals in this process. Some examples: there is a relationship between air pollution and childhood leukemia. Endocrine disruptors are associated with breast and prostate cancer. Flame retardants are associated with kidney and testicular cancer. Pesticides are associated with childhood leukemia and lymphoma and a variety of solid tumors in adults. And we have learned about the disparities in exposures to toxic substances, with immigrants, people of color, and the poor all experiencing much greater exposure to environmental hazards than those in more affluent communities. Now, the good news is that this knowledge points us to new opportunities for preventing cancer. And as Julie mentioned, this is primary prevention, stopping harm before it is done by reducing exposure to these substances in our environment. And this is where you come in. The medical community has a great role to play in reducing people's exposure to harmful substances. First, we have to realize and make our patients realize that no one is protecting us, our family, and our patients from toxic exposures, not the government and surely not industry. This is where the medical community can step up and help people to protect themselves, just like they did with washing your hands or brushing your teeth. You can help people realize that they must act by using their purchasing power to promote non-toxic products and to serve as advocates for clean air, food, and water. They have the power to reduce their exposure to toxic substances. And the purpose of these sessions is to give you, the medical and public health communities, the tools to help people take advantage of this opportunity for prevention. Thank you.
Thank you, Margaret. Our next speaker, Dr. David Michaels, is an epidemiologist and professor at the George Washington University School of Public Health. Dedicating much of his career to worker safety and health, he served as Assistant Secretary of Labor for the Occupational Safety and Health Administration. He's a leading thinker about threats to the integrity of the science behind public health and environmental protections. His book, The Triumph of Doubt, Dark Money and the Science of Deception, describes the challenge of defending public health science from targeted attacks by chemical and drug makers. David, thank you.
Thank you, Julia. Thank you, Margaret, for a really important and insightful talk. I'm happy to be joining you here today. I'm going to turn on my slides. Great. Can everybody see my slides?
Yep.
Great. Well, thank you. So I'm going to be talking about something that has gotten a lot of press these days, which is disinformation, and particularly around environmental chemicals and the ability of those chemicals to cause cancer. As you heard, I've written a couple of books on this. Most recent, The Triumph of Doubt, Dark Money and the Science of Deception, where I give examples of this. This was written before COVID, though I could probably add another few chapters right now, given COVID. The basic premise in the book, in my work, is that right now it's become standard operating procedure for corporations to manufacture scientific uncertainty about the potential harms caused by their products or their activities. We see it everywhere, and once you start looking for it, you'll see it. A lot of it's accomplished using what I would call mercenary scientists who work for product defense consulting firms. These are firms that acknowledge what they're doing is not science, what they're doing is defending products. And of course, dates back to tobacco. We call this the Tobacco Playbook. After lawsuits in which tobacco had to divulge millions of pages of memos, came an understanding of exactly how they did it and what they did. Of course, this is the famous statement that came out of those memos: doubt is our product. That's what they were doing. They were trying to convince people that there was uncertainty about whether at this point lung cancer was caused by cigarette smoking, a lot of other things as well. They recognized that by establishing controversy, they didn't have to actually do anything to stop people from smoking. They could keep selling this deadly product. I like to show this is one of the many things they did that was aimed at physicians and scientists, tobacco and health research, again, trying to cause controversy, to show controversy, pointing out, for example, anything that suggested some other causes of lung cancer, like lung cancer rare in bald men. Sadly, not true. Of course, we saw the same thing, and we continue to see the same thing in terms of climate change. And the fossil fuel industry has long funded a number of so-called think tanks and contrarian scientists to claim that there is disagreement over global warming, over climate change. And this was something that was sent to every high school science teacher in the country to convince them that they shouldn't really be talking about climate change. So I want to give you a couple of examples how this is in play today. One example, a carcinogen diesel exhaust. And the black stuff that comes out of diesel engines has many components It's difficult to study because those of us who live near roads, for example, are exposed to many things. But the National Cancer Institute and the National Institute for Occupational Safety and Health attempted to study this question in a place where the only exposure was diesel exhaust, and this was done, therefore, in underground mines where the miners were not exposed to any other carcinogen. And they were able to show that, in fact, exposure to diesel exhaust increases risk of lung cancer. It's a long and sordid story how the industry tried to stop them from actually doing the studies, which I report in my book. But once the studies came out, it became very clear, not surprisingly, diesel engine emissions cause lung cancer. And that led to the International Agency for Research on Cancer classifying diesel engine exhaust as a human carcinogen. Now, some diesel engine companies actually said, we get this. The Cummins engine company, for example, said, we are going to manufacture engines which put out minimal amount of exhaust, and also we're going to try to move to electric engines. But most of the industry and the fossil fuel industry, which sells diesel oil, said, no, we have to fight this. And so what they did was they essentially hired mercenary scientists to publish in the scientific literature, in the medical literature, in journals that you might read, saying, well, this isn't really true. And so what they did was they hired some scientists and they started essentially doing what I call strategic literature reviews. And you'll see these where they're not new data, but someone says, well, we reviewed the literature and it's just not convincing. And they did one, and then they did another, and they did another. Then they did something that epidemiologists sort of laugh at. I'm an epidemiologist. I've seen this before. They get the raw data from a study and they reanalyze it. And that, it's not hard to take the data from a positive study and change the parameters, change the cut points, change statistical significance, and all of a sudden you've got a negative study. They did that a couple of times. They did some more studies. They kept doing it over and over again. Now, more and more studies have come out showing that diesel engine exhaust is carcinogenic, but they will fight this rearguard action as long as they can so they can keep selling their dangerous products. Another example are these fluorinated compounds that you've no doubt read about, called them PFAS. You've seen the movie, perhaps, Dark Waters, about various diseases that are associated with exposure in one community outside of a DuPont plant in West Virginia. This has been another area where the manufacturers of PFAS have hired scientists to essentially say, look, it's not very dangerous. And so it dates back to the beginning of this outbreak in West Virginia, when people began to be concerned. And so at DuPont's recommendation, DuPont being the manufacturer there, told West Virginia, hire this firm to calculate what's a safe level in drinking water. And so West Virginia did that. And they recommended, well, anything over 150 parts per billion might be dangerous. Internally, DuPont acknowledged that 1 part per billion was the safe level, and anything above that would be dangerous. Then they hired another firm, ChemRisk, you may see their name around, to estimate, okay, people who live in this community, the people who were the subject of that movie, Dark Waters, saying, what's the risk from these exposures? And they said the risk was very, very low. Essentially, you have to be exposed 50,000 times the amount that they were estimating people were exposed to get sick. And that was published in the peer-reviewed literature, and people heard about it. It was promoted. But in fact, there were studies that were done by epidemiologists who were paid by DuPont as a result of this lawsuit. They were independent scientists, and they found, in fact, increased risk of kidney and testicular cancer in workers there. They also found immunological impacts and high cholesterol levels in the community. There was no question about that. And these were probably the best environmental studies we'll ever be able to do, because there was so much money behind it. Tens of thousands of people gave blood samples. In response, you had manufacturers of PFAS hiring these firms. Exponent reviewed the literature, and they said, no, there's no literature, there's no evidence that they cause, there's a causal relationship between, in this case, PFAS exposure and cancer in humans. When the National Toxicology Program reviewed these chemicals, 3M in this case, or another manufacturer, hired Gradient, which is a very well-known Cambridge, Massachusetts-based firm, and they essentially reviewed it and they said, no, we look at the literature. Of course, you could look at the literature and claim it says anything. But look, it's just not very dangerous, not nearly as dangerous as the government is saying. And that goes on and on. There's a big lawsuit by Minnesota because of the contamination of the water outside of a 3M plant. So they hired Exponent essentially to do that same sort of review and say, look, there's really no causal association between these exposures and really any specific outcome. I guess the state of Minnesota didn't really trust that that report was going to be powerful enough because they settled that suit for $850 million. So we see it over and over and over again. And of course, I see it because I could trace the same companies making the same claims for so many different chemicals. But if you go onto the Glassdoor website, Glassdoor being a platform where people can talk about their jobs, they can compare salaries and say, what's it like to work for that company? And you go see what some of the people on Glassdoor say. So for Cardno, employee said, look, this isn't a science consulting company. It's a legal consulting company. You go work there. You're not a scientist. What you're trying to do is, and this is something Margaret referred to, you're trying to make things that are guilty look innocent. It's legal. It's what a defense lawyer does, but you're doing it for science. Another company, Gradient, employee said, the principals there have questionable ethics, right? Or Exponent, which is the biggest of these companies. Look, if you come work here, you're going to be working for the evildoers trying to make it look like they did nothing wrong. So you can see what these companies are like, but you will recognize them. They will publish articles in any journal they can get their publications in. It's not going to be JAMA or the New England Journal of Medicine or Lancet, but in specialized journals, often journals that really they control. Of course, if you do your literature search, Medline, or now you use Google, and you find the study in the in inhalation toxicology or a journal you might not know, you have to be on your lookout for any of these firms, because these firms, their business model is to create studies that defend products. If they weren't providing studies that their sponsors needs, they go out of business. You never see studies saying, we were hired by this company to look at their product and we found it's really dangerous. We told them to stop publishing it. They never do that. They always defend the product. And you see this across the board. I've seen these companies in every one of these areas. They worked for they even worked for the NFL, not so much around chronic traumatic encephalopathy, but when the NFL wanted to go after Tom Brady for deflating the football, many of you in Boston will remember that championship game, they hired Exponent, and they did the same sort of analysis that the NFL wanted, and numerous physicists around the country said, look, this is nonsense. But you will see them over and over and over again do that same thing. It has a big impact. It has an impact not just on the practice of physicians. These are used in litigation. They're used to slow down regulation. I ran the Occupational Safety and Health Administration for more than 7 years, and I saw companies that didn't want workers to be protected would bring these scientists out to say, look, and literally they would say, we didn't prove that silica causes silicosis, which of course is nonsense, but that's what they do. And I think this impacts science and our ability actually to follow the science, these things we talk about today a lot. There's a great deal of cynicism about science because these are scientists who are really doing work that I wouldn't call science at all, because they're not answering questions, they're really providing product defense. So I think there are some things we could really do to stop this. I think we have to have a system where we don't allow regulatory capture. That our regulatory agencies really are independent from these companies, which they often have to rely on for funding, for example, to do a lot of the studies on the materials they regulate. We have to remember that, and we say this in epidemiology all the time, the absence of evidence of harm is not the evidence of absence of harm. If you don't have strong data saying that something is dangerous, that doesn't mean it's not dangerous. And certainly here you have some scientists whose job it is to throw confusion into the mix. Literally, I've seen memos that say time for more confusion. So we recognize that when we're dealing with human exposures, there's always going to be uncertainty. We can't do clinical trials where you expose people to a carcinogen for 30 years and you randomly expose some people to the carcinogen and some people not, right? You can't do that. And so you have to use these human studies that aren't perfect, and you have to use animal studies and extrapolate from them. There's always going to be uncertainty, but we have to make decisions on the basis of the best available evidence. And essentially, if we look at what the uncertainty is, we have to say, well, what are the implications? If we don't move forward now, are people going to be hurt? And we have to be able to ignore these conflicted scientists. When research published by scientists who are conflicted, who are paid by the industry that doesn't want to be regulated, we have to essentially throw them out. Look, Juul and the e-cigarette companies have paid for a number of studies that have shown that the risk of lung disease from e-cigarettes is tiny. Would you believe them? It may be right, but I don't think so. It turns out that independent scientists who look at the same subjects find far more harm in the effects of exposure to vaping products than scientists paid by a company that's controlled by Altria, which, the Philip Morris company. And so we need unconflicted science to base our decisions on. And so this is really one of the things I'm focused on, which essentially we need a system that says that if you produce a product, it should be tested, but you shouldn't control the research. You should pay for the testing. And if there are allegations of harm, you should pay for the research into the allegations of harm. But you can't control it, because if you control it, you will hire people who will give you the answer that you want. And so this research has to be directed by unconflicted, independent scientists. I think that's what's really important. While we're thinking about this system and the system we need, I think we also have to look at this question of how we understand the impacts of toxic chemicals. We have these very, very powerful studies on two of the chemicals in the PFAS class, PFOA and PFAS, because of the studies that came out of West Virginia, and DuPont had to pay for them. We have some data on 3 or 4 of these other chemicals, but there are 9,000 chemicals in this class. So we can't simply say, well, we can regulate these 2, because companies go on to other chemicals, and we wait until see if people are being sickened by them. That's the body in the morgue method. And if we regulate, as we have to do at OSHA, for example, we do one chemical, and then the manufacturers move to a different chemical, we haven't really solved the problem. It's regulatory whack-a-mole. So we have to look at categories of chemicals to make sure people are going to be safe from those exposures. And as Margaret said, chemicals are not innocent until proven guilty. That is a paradigm that's really important for people. When people get arrested, they're innocent until proven guilty, but chemicals shouldn't be treated that way. We should end the presumption of innocence. We should demand, as other countries are doing now, say, we shouldn't let chemicals get on the market until we're absolutely sure they're safe. So thank you so much for your work. I know you care about your patients, you care about the environment, you care about society. You wouldn't be here. And I'm really pleased you're able to pursue that further. Thank you.
Thank you, David. I just want to remind everyone there are 2 buttons at the bottom of your Zoom screen. One says chat, one says Q&A. To ask a question that we can answer either in writing or in the discussion later on, please put your question in the Q&A box. We look forward to hearing what's on your mind. And now let me turn to introducing Ruthann Rudel. Ruthann Rudel is a toxicologist and exposure scientist and director of research at Silent Spring Institute. She published the first major review of animal mammary gland carcinogens in the journal Cancer. Her exposure studies include the first US measurements indoors for dozens of endocrine active chemicals, showing that everyday products are major exposure sources. These studies have more than 1,000 citations to date and led the US EPA to expand its focus on indoor air. She served on EPA's Scientific Advisory Committee on Chemicals and the US National Toxicology Program Board of Scientific Counselors. Ruthann?
Thank you, Julie. What great presentations, and I'm so excited to be following Margaret and David. Can you see my slides?
Yep.
Great. All right. I want to thank you for being present and for caring about this. I've been studying how chemicals can cause breast cancer for over 25 years. And today I'm going to show just one example of what that evidence looks like. Specifically, I'll focus on one mechanism by which chemicals can increase breast cancer risk. So we take the same methods that drug companies use to find drugs that prevent breast cancer and then apply them to identify chemicals that might cause breast cancer. For instance, aromatase inhibitors are among the most common therapies for breast cancer because they block the aromatase enzyme, lowering production of estrogen and depriving breast cancers of the hormones they need to grow. We've discovered environmental chemicals that increase the production of estrogen or progesterone. So if we want to prevent cancer, these kinds of chemicals need to be thoroughly tested for safety. But as Dr. Kripke explained earlier, this is not how things are done in our current regulatory system. The bottom line, we do have opportunities to act on this information, and there is no excuse not to do so. So to figure out which chemicals might increase breast cancer risk, we are joining research from two different scientific universes. The first is cancer biology and etiology, which is focused on the question of how breast cancer develops. What are the important pathways and mechanisms that lead to disease? The second universe is the field of toxicology, especially the new international effort known as Tox21 to get better at predicting toxicity. Tox21 uses technologies borrowed from pharma, like high-throughput molecular screening, to screen thousands of chemicals in cell-based assays that show if they activate a particular biological pathway or mechanism. So this screening can find chemicals that act on worrisome biological targets. Since many common chemicals aren't thoroughly tested for safety, this information helps prioritize chemicals that may cause health problems. Now, when we bring these two kinds of information together, boom, we can make inferences about chemicals that may affect specific diseases. These approaches are the foundation of Tox21. So we applied this approach in a recent paper, which was recognized by NIEHS as one of the top papers of 2021. We identified chemicals that increase synthesis of estradiol and progesterone in a cell-based assay and inferred from this activity that they may increase breast cancer risk. An invited commentary from IARC-associated scientists, including Dr. Guyton from session 1, explains that our approach is an application of the key characteristics of carcinogens model for identifying potential carcinogens. The key characteristics framework recognizes that carcinogens act by a variety of mechanisms beyond damaging DNA to cause cancer. Our study identified chemicals that fit into characteristic 8, modulates receptor-mediated effects, because they increase production of estradiol or progesterone by altering the process of steroidogenesis. So steroid hormones are synthesized in the body from cholesterol. No need to memorize this pathway, just relax. We use data from EPA's Tox21 related testing of 2,000 chemicals in the H295R steroidogenesis assay. The assay measures each of these 11 hormones in a cell culture to check if chemical exposure causes an increase or a decrease. We use the EPA data to identify chemicals that increase estradiol or progesterone levels. We focused on these two hormones because they play such an important role in most breast cancers. For example, women at high inherited risk may choose to reduce that risk by removing their ovaries, thus reducing the hormones. And many studies have demonstrated a similar dependency on these hormones in experimental animals. Estrogen and progesterone hormone replacement therapy increases breast cancer risk. And women with a gene for elevated aromatase, which results in more estradiol, have poor survival for hormone receptor positive breast cancer. Finally, treatments for hormone receptor positive breast cancer to prevent recurrence interrupt the estrogen pathway in the breast with tamoxifen or aromatase inhibitors. Tamoxifen blocks the estrogen receptor, while aromatase inhibitors block production of estradiol. So they work in two different ways. Now, it's always helpful to see what the data look like. So here's the assay data for a chemical you might have heard about called DMBA. DMBA is a PAH family chemical that happens to be especially good at causing mammary tumors in experimental animals. It's been used since the 1960s to do that, so scientists could study breast cancer. Now, the estradiol concentrations in these H295R cells are increased, you can see that on the y-axis, with increasing concentration of DMBA on the x-axis. The values in red are above a significance threshold, though the increase begins at even lower doses. This mechanism of increasing estradiol may explain why DMBA specifically makes tumors in the mammary gland. Now, EPA did this kind of testing for about 2,000 chemicals, and we used the results to identify about 300 chemicals with the strongest effects. We mapped out these chemicals to help us see which have the highest effect at the lowest dose. Those riskiest ones are in the upper left-hand corner. Others on the graph may also have important effects, especially if exposures are widespread. And so we plotted this list of chemicals into a risk map according to how strongly they increased estradiol. Again, the strongest chemicals are in blue in the upper left. And so this list includes pesticides like atrazine, diazinon, and malathion, which your patients may use at home or at work, or which can contaminate drinking water. Includes industrial chemicals like xylitol and air pollution like cresol and other PAHs. It includes commercial and consumer products like phthalates and benzophenone from food packaging and sunscreens. It includes natural products like clove oil, and there's DMBA. There are so many important questions that now need to be answered about these chemicals. What's the biological mechanism that leads to this effect? What's the downstream result of these changes? How much exposure is there? Where does it come from? And are the effects of multiple exposures additive? We produced a similar risk map for chemicals that increase progesterone synthesis, and we hope you'll look for it in the paper. So we identified this list of chemicals of concern and prioritized them by how strong they were. And we also wanted to add information about how people are exposed. To do this, we used EPA's new exposure forecasting database, which provides some information about whether the chemicals are in pesticide formulations, in food packaging or additives, whether they're drinking water contaminants or in consumer products or in pharmaceutical formulations, or if they're used in industry where workers and local communities may be exposed. You can check the paper for details, and the bottom line that I have time for now is that many of these, in the hundreds, are common sources of exposure through these diverse uses. Now, in drug testing, the next step after cell culture tests would be testing in experimental animals, also called in vivo testing. Using the same logic, we went to the literature to see what effects had been reported in experimental animal studies. We searched the strongest E2-up chemicals for effects that might be related to increased estradiol synthesis. Consistent with our hypothesis that this is an important mechanism for endocrine disruption, we found strong signs of endocrine effects for many of the chemicals, including effects on mammary gland and lactation. Now, our search was challenging for two important reasons. Several of these are pesticides, and the studies are not available to the public since they are often protected as confidential business information. Secondly, mammary effects are not checked very well in these studies. We found that testing protocols don't examine the mammary gland sufficiently to detect changes, that mammary effects are not reported consistently, and that often effects that are observed are dismissed. So a key takeaway for prevention is that we need to do a much better job detecting chemicals that affect breast development, lactation, and cancer, as current approaches miss many effects. We also evaluated whether our results were consistent with other risk assessments. We checked if each chemical on our list was classified by government agencies as carcinogenic, or unlikely to be carcinogenic, or as having inadequate evidence to decide. And we did the same using an EPA database to check whether effects on reproduction and development had been observed, whether it had been tested but no effects were observed, or whether it wasn't tested. We found that chemicals that increased estrogen and progesterone were much more likely to be carcinogenic or reproductive and developmental toxicants versus not. So that's consistent with our hypothesis that this mechanism is important for cancer and reproductive and developmental harm. However, more than half of the chemicals on our list have not been tested to check if they cause these effects. So follow-up studies are a priority. So how can we fill these knowledge gaps? How do we use this information to prevent cancer? Well, there are many ways all of us can use this list. First, knowing about this biological activity provides useful evidence for existing and forthcoming chemical risk assessments. Thinking about causation, we can be more confident that breast cancers or mammary tumors that are observed in a study are caused by a particular exposure if we also know the agent has this biological activity that would be expected to lead to these tumors. For example, we've published concerns about pesticide risk assessments where authorities dismissed mammary tumors that had been observed. If we now show that these pesticides also increase synthesis of hormones that increase mammary tumors, it supports a decision to reconsider those pesticide registrations. And also, as I mentioned earlier, chemicals on this list that haven't been tested in vivo ought to be, with careful examination for effects on the mammary gland, which we would expect to be affected by chemicals that can do this. Some manufacturers and consumers might prefer to avoid exposures, even as questions remain about health effects in people. So this list provides a guide for chemicals to avoid on a precautionary basis, especially the ones that show relevant effects in experimental animal studies already. In addition, this list can help focus the design of future breast cancer epidemiologic studies by providing a rational approach for selecting exposures to study. And we've already used this list as a basis for developing computational models that use chemical structure to predict chemicals that will increase estrogen or progesterone. Two more thoughts to consider about this. Mixtures. We're exposed to many of these chemicals at the same time. Research shows that even as singular low doses of endocrine active chemicals may not cause an observable effect, when mixed together, they often do. So mixtures matter. Second, they are not all carcinogens. Just because a chemical can make more estrogen or progesterone in this cell culture does not mean it definitely causes breast cancer. For example, perhaps some chemicals are not easily absorbed into the body or are rapidly metabolized or don't distribute to breast tissue. Despite the uncertainties, the fact that these chemicals can increase these hormones raises concern. Concerns which should be the basis to evaluate the chemicals more rigorously and consider exposure reduction, especially when in vivo studies also show effects. In conclusion, we found about 300 chemicals that increase production of estrogen and progesterone in vitro, and these are hormones that strongly influence breast cancer. In fact, these hormones are so significant in breast cancer that reducing them is the primary target of treatment to reduce recurrence, as exposure could add significant risks. Yes, there are still important knowledge gaps. So until there's more information about safety, common sense protocols to follow up on these findings and precautions to limit widespread exposure until we know more make sense for prevention. And happy Women's History Month. It does feel like we've been here before, doesn't it? Let me wrap up by emphasizing this framework for cancer prevention science. The take home is that with a relevant biological mechanism and human exposure, there's a reasonable basis for action to scrutinize these chemicals and to reduce exposures and associated risks. Those of us who have spent our careers studying how chemicals cause cancer know the challenges of proving this connection. At the same time, we're aware that all of us experience exposures to thousands of chemicals that haven't been well studied. An effective cancer prevention strategy will need to shift this paradigm because waiting for proof before we act is not prevention. My hope is that this work helps health professionals better understand the nature of available evidence and highlights where there are opportunities to acknowledge these risks with patients and colleagues and in your communities. I encourage you to continue to learn more about environmental health and to advocate for more coverage of this topic in medical and nursing education and in the related licensing exams and boards. We hope you can also integrate this new information into your practice, For example, by collecting workplace exposure information from your patients, and by seeking information resources that you think can be helpful for patients who want to take precautionary actions. I applaud all of you for being here, and I want to recognize the power you have as trusted communicators. Thank you, especially to my fabulous co-author, Bethsaida Cardona. I look forward to your questions.
Thank you, Ruthann. Now I want to open the discussion to our panelists. I will introduce all of them, and then each of them will have a few minutes to comment on what they've heard and their own experience, and then we'll have some questions for them. So first, Dr. Phil Landrigan is a pediatrician and epidemiologist, skilled at giving everyday advice without blaming patients for their disease. He also speaks publicly about potential environmental causes of disease. He's the director at the Global Observatory on Pollution and Health at Boston College and a member of the National Institute of Medicine. He was previously chair of the Department of Preventive Medicine at Mount Sinai Medical Center in New York. His early research contributed to the US decision to remove lead from paint and gasoline, actions that reduced blood lead levels in the US by more than 90%, a remarkable success for prevention. Amy Kostant offers practical guidance for scientists and clinicians to advance public understanding via the news media. She is the founder and executive director of Science Communication Network, working for more and deeper media coverage of important research in order to increase environmental and public health awareness. She trains scientists and facilitates communications between scientists and reporters to improve the odds that science will be reported accurately. And Dr. Gary Ellison offers perspective from the National Cancer Institute and National Institute of Environmental Health Sciences. He's a cancer epidemiologist and chief of the Environmental Epidemiology branch at NCI. He oversees a program of extramural research focused on modifiable factors, spanning all domains of the exposed zone, including the broader social context, lifestyle, and chemical pollutants, as well as biomarkers of effect. His leadership for the NIH Breast Cancer in the Environment Research Program led to an NIH Award of Merit. I'm delighted to hear the very latest from NCI from him. And now I'm going to turn to Phil for our first set of remarks.
Julia, thank you very much, and thanks to the organizers for having invited me. Let me share my screen. I've got a very brief slide deck I want to show. Right, so I want to focus on childhood cancer, and I'd like to pick up on a couple of the themes that Margaret Kripke, David Michaels, Ruthann, Rudel have laid out, and then apply them specifically to the situation with childhood cancer. So childhood cancer is numerically not a big part of the cancer picture in the United States. The great majority of cancers occur in adults, but nonetheless, there are more than 16,000 new cases diagnosed each year. And because many cancer cases lead to premature death, cancer is in children is the second leading cause of pediatric death, surpassed only by injuries. The good news here is the cancer deaths among American children are way down. I remember way back in the years 1968 to 1970, I was a resident in pediatrics at Boston Children's Hospital, and people like Robert Gross were just beginning to realize that childhood cancer could be treatable. At that time, no child with cancer survived. Some lasted a few months, some lasted a couple of years, but in those days, a diagnosis of cancer was a death sentence. Then, with the work of Gross at Children's, the work of people like Holland at Roswell Park Cancer Institute in Buffalo, New York, in the mid-1970s was reported the first 5-year survival of a child with cancer. And today, a very high proportion of children with cancer survive, which is why cancer deaths among American children are down. But offsetting that is the bad news. And the bad news is that even though the percentage of children dying with cancer is going down, and even though the absolute number of children with cancer is going down, the cancer incidence, that is to say, the number of new cases per 1,000 children in the United States, is going up. It's going up for all forms of pediatric cancer. It's going up for testicular cancer in adolescents and young men. Here's a graph showing those two lines, with mortality going down, the blue line, but incidence going up. And that spans the years from 1972, when we began keeping national records, until the past decade. And here are some actual numbers. The top line is all cancer types combined in children, which is up 35% since 1972. And then you see the numbers for leukemia, for lymphoma, for brain cancer, all of which is up. Testicular cancer is up about 55%. What are the causes? Well, this kind of a shift is far too rapid to be genetic. I know there's been a great, enormous focus in recent years on the genetic origins of cancer, very important research, which has yielded many breakthroughs, but genetics cannot account for this kind of a rapid 35% increase in all forms of cancer in 5 decades. Genetic change takes place over centuries. Some of it's probably better diagnosis, especially in the case of brain cancers, because we have new imaging like MRI and CAT scans. But CAT scans have been around for a long time now. MRI has been around for a long time, and cancer incidence is still going up. So that's not the whole story, though it may be a bit of it. Bad luck? I don't think so. And finally, environmental exposures. I think by default, this is the most likely. If it's not genetics, if it's not better diagnosis, then it's going to be something external, namely the environment, broadly defined. So what do we know about the environment? My colleagues have already spoken to this, so I'll just go over it quickly. There are more than 80,000 manufactured chemicals in commerce today, most invented since World War II. They're everywhere. They're widely distributed in the environment. You can find persistent organic chemicals 6 miles beneath the surface of the Pacific Ocean in the Marianas Trench, and you can find them in the ice at the North Pole. They're everywhere. And they're in us. The CDC does rolling surveys across the United States every year. They take blood samples, they take urine samples, and they are routinely picking up several hundred manufactured chemicals in all of us, in every one of the 157 people on this webinar. And here's the clicker. David Michaels has already said it, Ruthann has already said it, but I need to say it again, that no basic information is available on, and Margaret Kripke most certainly said this, no basic information is available on more than half, in fact, more than 75% of the chemicals that are in use. Margaret said it well. Nobody is looking out for our welfare. Nobody's testing chemicals before they come to market. We're behaving in a reactionary fashion, trying to detect damage after it has already occurred. What do we know about the connections between chemicals and other environmental exposures of cancer? Well, we know that radiation pushes up cancer rates. We learned back in the 1960s and 70s that diethylstilbestrol, DES, caused cancer in young women. That was really a wake-up call that chemicals could cause cancer in children. Ultraviolet radiation, that link is well recognized. We now know that solvents like benzene can cause leukemia and lymphoma in children, and we've seen cases. Leukemia and lymphoma also result from childhood exposure to 1,3-butadiene. Butadiene is a chemical used to produce synthetic rubber. And in the town of Port Arthur, Texas, a school that was located across the street from a 1,3-butadiene factory had a whopping increase in the incidence of childhood leukemia and lymphoma. We now know that pesticide exposure, especially prenatal exposure, results in leukemia. That information has been well documented through the agricultural health study conducted by the National Cancer Institute. Glyphosate, the world's most widely used herbicide, is now classified by the World Health Organization, the International Agency for Research on Cancer, as a probable cause of lymphoma. Nitrosamines found in drink and well water are linked to liver cancer. Arsenic, which is found in northern New England, parts of the southwestern United States, is linked to multiple cancers. The sweetener, aspartame, high-quality animal studies conducted in Italy at the Ramazzini Institute have shown unequivocally that aspartame is linked to leukemia and lymphoma. And these studies have shown that when aspartame is given to pregnant female rats, then it pushes up rates of leukemia and lymphoma in the offspring, and it does so at lower doses than cause cancer in adults. This information has not yet been confirmed in humans, but it's a question that cries out for clinical and epidemiologic evaluation. And then there's also good news. There's a yin and a yang here. Biology is complicated. And we know that some environmental exposures actually protect children against cancer, folic acid during pregnancy, prolonged breastfeeding. So there's stuff that goes in both directions. What we need here in this context of rising incidence of childhood cancer, children's uncontrolled exposure to chemicals, clear evidence that certain chemicals cause cancer, is a new national cancer prevention plan. The centerpiece of this, and David Michaels touched on this, Margaret touched on this, Ruthann touched on this, is that chemicals have to be tested for carcinogenicity. They have to be tested for toxicity before they come to market. In the European Union, the mantra on chemical regulation is simple. No data, no market. If a chemical company wants to bring a chemical to market, they have to produce data showing that the chemical is safe. Not so in this country. So what happens is the chemicals not allowed in consumer products in the EU get dumped over here. That's not right. If we really want our kids to be exposed to chemicals that European children are not exposed to, we need to conduct research, of course. It's the basis of evidence-based prevention. The regulatory agencies like EPA have to take children's unique susceptibilities into account when they're doing the risk assessments and setting the regulations. We have to act on what we know. We know a lot already, and we need a second front in the war on cancer, which is based not on the reactionary principle, but on the precautionary principle. We have to assume that chemicals are dangerous before they come to market. We have to test them. We have to act to protect health. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Phil. And let's turn to Amy.
Great, thank you. So much incredibly important information here. People really need to know about it. So a lot of people get their news about health solely from the media. It's really important that you as medical experts consider talking with reporters to share this information with them. The job of news reporters is to report facts, right? It's to report what's known. You turn on the news to see what we know. It makes the reporter's job really easy when someone comes to them and says, there's nothing to worry about here, or exposure to chemical A causes health effect B. It's really concrete, easy to understand, easy to report. But the real picture, as we've heard, is a lot more nuanced, and most reporters know that. So I think the hardest part, and what I want to talk about here, is communicating uncertainty that's inherent in good science and still giving reporters something they can report, something solid, things that are certain. And good science doesn't always provide that kind of certainty. People still need to know about it. So how do you give the reporters something solid enough to report without overstating what the science tells us? Essentially, you don't hide from the uncertainty. You tell the reporter what you know, and you acknowledge uncertainty where it exists. For example, if your research or the research you're talking about based on was done using animals, and the reporter says, well, what does this mean for my audience, people? You could say, we've certainly seen enough evidence in the lab or enough animal research to be concerned to investigate further, whatever you want to say, but we don't know for absolute certain at what level this causes health harm. It would be unethical to test it on humans, for example. You can talk about the strength of the animal research. You can bring in epidemiology. There's a really great phrase, we know enough to know. And here's an example of how that can work, especially with reporters. An example, Sandy Lamott from CNN was writing about a study, lead author was Stephanie Engel at UNC Chapel Hill. And Dr. Engel's quote was, we have enough evidence right now to be concerned about the impact of these chemicals on a child's risk of attention, learning, and behavioral disorders. So Dr. Engel didn't say, the exposure, orthophthalates, causes brain damage, but she made clear that we know enough to know that this looks like a big problem. We need to do something about it. So you don't need to go beyond what you know or beyond where the science is, but you can still have a tremendous impact and share information with people. I want to talk a little about balance. Going back to what David Michael said about mercenary scientists, these folks reach out to reporters, sometimes aggressively. A good news story shows at least two sides of something, right? It's called balance. It makes drama in a story, and reporters aim for that. So if they interview you, they're probably going to interview someone with another point of view. Knowing that, you can do a little research in advance. You can figure out what the reporters are going to hear from these mercenary scientists, and you can prepare to address those points in your interview. So other things that you might hear from reporters are, tell me 5 things my readers, my audience can do to protect themselves from this exposure. If you're comfortable giving this information, that's terrific. If not, you can rely on fact sheets. Silent Spring has great ones, and IEHS, they're at CDC, there's some wonderful ones. Reporters will really appreciate that help. But the main thing in talking to reporters is to be prepared. Know that an interview can be friendly, it can be conversational, but it's not a chat. You want to go into an interview with a very clear idea of what you want the reporter to walk away with. The 2 or 3 main points you hope you'll see in every story that you've been interviewed for. Repeat that point several times during an interview. Say it several different ways, and you're guiding the reporter to understanding what's really important. And reporters are smart. They'll appreciate the help, and they'll know that this is a way to balance their story when they're getting other types of input. I do hope that you'll all consider talking with reporters. We really need to share all this terrific information with the public. People want to know.
Thank you so much, Amy, for those great practical tips on how to talk with reporters, and the encouragement for experts, including doctors and nurses, who are very trusted communicators, to engage. And I'm delighted next to turn the microphone to Gary.
Thank you, Julia. And thank you for the opportunity to participate in this panel discussion. I found the presentations and discussions of this and the previous sessions to be quite engaging and informative. First, I just want to say something about cancer. We talk about cancer as if it's one disease often, but cancer is more than one disease and is quite complex, right? And also complex is the environment and our relationship to it. And this makes the environment's relationship to cancer difficult to study in humans with the long latency of cancer and dynamism of the environment and its people and interaction with genes being among the key challenges. And David and Amy mentioned that it would be unethical to randomize people to potentially harmful substances to see if it causes cancer. So to understand the impact of environmental exposure and cancer demands, in addition to the animal studies and mechanistic studies that Ruthann talked about, demands that we follow large groups of people prospectively and accurately collecting information on exposures in the environment and observing the incidence of cancer and cancer-related outcomes. So I've been asked to discuss the National Cancer Institute and National Institute of Environmental Health Sciences partnership to support new cohorts to assess environmental exposures and cancer risk. But before I do that, I want to also mention, existing resources available to study the environment and cancer risk. The National Cancer Institute Cohort Consortium addresses the need for large-scale collaborations to pool large quantities of data and biospecimens necessary to conduct a wide range of cancer studies. And this consortium includes about 61 high-quality cohorts from at least 15 countries with extensive risk factor data from more than 7 million participants and biospecimens, including germline DNA from more than 2 million participants. So in addition, NCI supports the infrastructure of several important cancer epidemiology, risk, and survivor cohorts, including some you might be familiar with, the Health Professionals Follow-Up Study, the Nurses Health Study, and the Nurses Health Study 2. These are well-known Harvard cohorts that have done a great job in supplying the data that we need to make public health decisions. And so collectively, this infrastructure program includes more than 1 million and largely white and aging individuals. So the assessment of cancer risk from environmental exposures requires new prospective cohort studies, taking advantage of new technological advances to characterize exposures and the appropriate windows of susceptibility where exposures may have the most impact on risk for cancer. So the National Cancer Institute and the National Institute of Environmental Health Sciences recently funded new cancer epidemiology cohorts to enable evaluation of emerging and really important environmental exposures on cancer risk. And I'm happy to say that this is a brand new effort, and the kickoff meeting was just held in early February. So we're really excited about this new initiative, this well-needed initiative. So these cohorts are racially and ethnically diverse, which is extremely important given what I mentioned about the cohorts that we currently support. They will collect data on a wide variety of exposures and will consider intermediate factors like associations between exposures and biomarkers described as key characteristics of carcinogens that Ruthann mentioned during her talk. They will also include community engagement to inform and enhance research in communities, and a coordinating center that will identify common themes and explore emerging scientific opportunities. And collectively, these observational studies will include close to 190,000 individuals from the United States West, East, South, and Midwest. And we hope to understand how multiple exposures to environmental toxicants across a diverse population of pregnant women and their offspring are linked to cancer risks, how an array of environmental exposures are potentially hematologic carcinogens in a large family-based study, the impact of environmental factors and cancer risk among racial ethnic minorities and individuals from low socioeconomic status communities, and the impact of environmental exposures among individuals who will be recruited from environmental justice hotspots in Michigan. Think the Flint water crisis, right? So among the environmental exposures are PFAS, mentioned several times over the course of these sessions, PCBs, phthalates, and other plasticizers, toxic metals, air and water pollution, pesticides, and mixtures, among others. These cohorts will assess exposures through questionnaire data, new technology, silicone wristbands, biospecimens such as blood, urine, hair, and nails, saliva, and dried blood spots and teeth to measure chemical exposures. And they will use omic technologies that will shed light on the mechanisms of environmental outcomes. So investigators, shed light on the mechanisms of environmental exposures in cancer. And so there will be several years before we're able to see any cancer outcomes. So these individuals are healthy individuals and they will be followed for the incidence of cancer, right? And so we're likely won't see enough cancer outcomes in the beginning. So investigators have proposed to look at factors that are intermediate to cancer and what has been deemed characteristics of carcinogens again. For example, investigators have proposed to look at NAFLD or precursors for liver cancer. Epigenetics and accelerated aging are some of the factors that they will look at. Inflammatory biomarkers, immune modulation, and dysregulation markers, as well as oxidative stress and DNA damage. So untangling the complexity of the environment and risk for cancer is of great importance to NCI, who has taken a lead on this effort with support from NCI. So I'll stop here. It was my hope to just let you know that NCI is engaged in furthering the study of the environment and cancer. We have a number of resources available for investigators to pursue their own research questions regarding the environment and cancer. And I can share some of that with you in the chat box. And thank you for your attention. And thanks again for this opportunity.
Thank you, Gary. I'm very excited about these new cancer cohorts, and I'm hopeful that this represents a real turning point in our opportunity to learn more about environmental causes of cancer. I think it's a really a very important shift going on here. And I'm delighted now to turn to some questions. Phil, let's start with you. It's because I'm delighted that we have many doctors and nurses with us today. It's not realistic to expect healthcare providers, even these special people who have joined us and have an interest in the field, to be experts on all the aspects of environmental health. How can doctors best handle questions in this area?
Yeah, well, that's a key question, because pediatric practitioners are overburdened today with so many forms of anticipatory guidance that they have to give to patients, so many questions they're required to ask. But what I would say is some advice that's intended to cut through the complexity and simplify the process is, number one, whenever there is a child with a new diagnosis of cancer, ask a few basic questions. Doesn't have to be more than a couple of minutes. Ask about radiation exposure, ask about exposure to chemicals, ask where the family lives. If that family happens to have moved to Boston from Port Arthur, Texas, where 1,3-butadiene exposures are rampant, that's a significant piece of information. The second thing is that frontline pediatricians, nurse practitioners, others who provide care to children don't have to go it alone. One of the things we've done in this country over the past couple of decades is we've built a network of resources in children's environmental health. It's not as deep as the resource network in, say, pulmonary medicine or hematology, but in every region of the country now, supported by CDC, there's a program called a Pediatric Environmental Health Specialty Unit. And in Boston, for example, it's located at Children's Hospital, directed by Dr. Alan Wolf, Dr. Marissa Hauptman, and a great team. These are pediatricians who are cross-trained in toxicology and environmental medicine, who stand ready to serve as consultants to frontline pediatricians. Just as a frontline doc wouldn't think of managing a complex asthma case by herself, why should she do an investigation into the possible environmental origins of a new case of cancer by herself? But it does make sense when a new cancer comes along to make a phone call, send an email, ask a question, and ask for a second opinion. And all of that, of course, is entirely consistent with the way medical practice is done these days. So that's my recommendation.
Very helpful. I wonder if others have resources that you want to pitch in to offer for routine care situations. I know I have a couple of favorite resources. The Breast Cancer and Environment Research Program has put out some fact sheets intended for parents of girls reaching puberty that I think are really helpful. And I have to mention Silent Spring Institute offers easy tips on your smartphone or computer in the Detox Me smartphone app.
And Julia, you mentioned the Breast Cancer and Environment Research Program. They also have fact sheets targeted to the healthcare providers as well.
Ah, thank you. Thank you very much. So this next critical question, let's start with Gary and then David. What are your thoughts about how environmental exposures contribute to health inequalities? Gary?
Oh, wow, that's
I'm sorry you can't have all day, but that's why I'm calling it a critical question.
Yes, it is. And very important question. And, one that I hope that these new cohorts will contribute to answering more, given that we're actually going to be doing studies in these underrepresented populations who probably have the highest exposure to harmful environmental toxicants. So I believe exposure to harmful substances is a consequence of racial and ethnic and socioeconomic status inequities, largely related to structural factors like racism and racial segregation and policies that disadvantage racial and ethnic minorities and individuals from low socioeconomic status backgrounds. And historically, there have been policies like you may have heard of redlining that forced minorities, primarily Black people, to neighborhoods with proximity to environmental hazards. Lack of resources like grocery stores, for example, with fresh fruits and vegetables, potentially increasing their frequency, duration, and dose to these harmful substances. And as I mentioned before, the new cohorts will characterize the environment, several different types of environments, and assess the cancer risk in some of these communities. And I believe this work is timely and very important.
And let me add, first, I want to really point out something that Gary said that you don't often hear in these discussions, which is, the proximate cause of environmental cancers are the environmental exposures. But we have to think beyond that. We have to talk about the policies and the programs and the inequities that resulted in those exposures, because we're not going to get rid of those things until we address those underlying policies, whether they're living in proximity to factories, belching out carcinogens, or the poor nutrition. And look, we saw all of this, and we continue to see all this with exposure to SARS-CoV-2, where people who could not stay home and were in these frontline jobs and often had to have two jobs just to be able to make a living, were in environments where they were much more heavily exposed at greater risk of SARS. And that's really what's COVID-19. And that's what we have to be looking at. The one thing I would add is, as bad as a lot of environmental exposures are, Cancer Alley, people living near factories that are putting out lead all over the country, the exposures in those workplaces are often far worse than they are outside the workplaces. And the same issues around inequity and environmental justice occur in those workplaces as well, where the lowest wage workers and the workers with the least protection and ability to protect themselves are often Black and brown workers. They're often immigrant workers, undocumented workers, and they pay the price. If you want more on this, Bob Bullard, who's sort of the father of the environmental justice movement, and I have a piece on this issue about the inside and outside the workplace in The Nation a couple of months ago. But I think we have to ask people what their jobs are, as well as where they live and nutritional status, things like that, because workplace exposures are really important in terms of understanding environmental cancer.
So true. Gary, you talked about partnership between NCI and the National Institute of Environmental Health Sciences, but my experience is that these two agencies have very different understandings about the role of environmental chemicals in cancer. Can you tell us what we can do to make more headway in this context?
Sure. I think for me, yeah, I've had the privilege of spending this past January through December of 2021 working on detail at NIEHS, and its depth and its breadth of the environment and its impact on a range of health outcomes it's extremely vast, right? So NCI shares an interest in the environment as it relates to cancer and has enjoyed a longstanding collaboration with NIEHS on issues concerning the environment and cancer. We can go way back to the Long Island Breast Cancer Study Project, and of course, the Breast Cancer and Environment Research Program that went on for many years. These are key examples of the relationship that we've had with NIEHS. And NCI has also collaborated with NIEHS on studies regarding mechanisms of the environment and cancer, such as DNA integrity. And more recently, NCI continues its collaboration with NIEHS on the HERE initiative. That's the Human Health Environmental Analysis Resource Initiative. And this gives, NCI funded investigators an opportunity to incorporate environmental exposures into their research. And also the new cohorts that I mentioned before on environmental exposures and cancer risk. NCI also has a robust intramural program focusing on occupational exposures and environmental epidemiology. That program is conducting research on several environmental and occupational exposures and cancer risks, including drinking water contaminants thought to be associated with cancer risks like arsenic, nitrates, and PFAS that we heard a lot about. And these studies, like the diesel exhaust examples cited by David, are used in the evaluation of evidence related to carcinogens. So to answer your question, NCI is a research institution. It continues to fund and conduct the research to understand the causes of cancer. And it often partners with other institutions like Mary White at the CDC, whose team has done an outstanding job of conducting workshops and seminars focused on cancer prevention based on what is known about exposures across the life course. And I participated in one, and I know that other NCI colleagues have participated as well. And I think that these collaborations that we continue to have, and not only the collaborations, but also taking the lead on exploring the environment and cancer will get us closer to preventing cancer in a way that I think we see other agencies do it. I think, NCI is also vast in its study of cancer because we have the cancer patient, we have clinical trials, treatment trials, we have factors looking at survivorship, and the environment that we explore is very broad. And I think it necessitates that we continue to collaborate with organizations like NIEHS that frankly have the mandate in the environment and has the breadth and depth of knowledge of the environment that's so critical to what we do.
So Gary, on behalf of all the researchers in our audience, I'm counting on you to help everyone navigate that complexity. And I know you will.
I tried, Julia, thank you.
I know you do. Amy, David described how industry can flood the literature with reviews saying there's nothing wrong.
Yes.
And we've seen this for climate change, tobacco, opioids. How can health professionals respond to industry's claims about chemicals when they're talking with the media?
Great question. I think Gary just used the phrase breadth and depth of the literature. And in fact, that's what you can do. You interview, you talk about what you know, but make sure the reporter knows that there are third-party validators, other people who can talk about this research or talk about the health effects, and you can refer them to these people. They'll get a sense that this isn't in a vacuum. This isn't just one group of people talking about it. We've been working on that for quite a few years, and I think a lot of reporters have started to understand that. It's also a great idea to offer a list of recent peer-reviewed publications that support the findings you're talking about, and to offer, if it's depending on the interview, beyond the science, you can offer people who are really great on policy around this or health affected communities, showing that this isn't just one study, because the approach that industry often takes is, well, yeah, but this is controversial, or this is just one study, when in fact, as we saw today, the evidence is quite strong.
Ruthann, you have a lot of experience doing this. Did you have something to add?
Well, there's my experience has been there's just an enormous imbalance of resources in who's producing science that's relevant to these questions. And so David, gave a really great summary, which I haven't really heard talked about enough, I think, in our circles, of how industry science is it's abundant, and it's very well financed. And on the other hand, researchers who are trying to do environmental health, especially with cancer, have to struggle to fund that research. NIEHS has sort of been a little bit hands-off of cancer because of NCI being the cancer place, but NCI has been rather uninterested in environmental cancers in some ways, I guess. I mean, it's there's funding there, but it's hard to get. So I just think there's underlying all of this is sort of an economics question, and I think the economics question is also underlying why don't we have stronger regulations that require testing. So maybe we should, I think that's where I'll leave it.
Margaret, I'm going to turn to you with the last question for our panel. Until recently, environmental chemicals haven't received a lot of attention in medicine, but it seems things are shifting, and this forum is a great example of that. I wonder if you could talk about what you see as the keys to bringing more focus to environmental chemicals and cancer prevention, say, in the next 10 years.
Wow. I think that things are beginning to change, and there's beginning to be some recognition that environmental influences really are important for public health. I think one of the things that would help change this is to have more people in the cancer research community aware of what's progress has been made in recent years and how important this is in terms of cancer causation. I think if Dr. Ellison would plot the amount of money spent on cancer treatment over time with the amount of money spent on cancer prevention over time, there would be a gigantic imbalance. And I'm hoping that some of that imbalance will be corrected. I was delighted to hear that the NCI is actually getting involved in some serious studies with NIEHS on environmental causes of cancer, because historically, I think this has been one of the underfunded and underrepresented areas of cancer research in general. So I'm looking forward to more activity in this area, more findings, more awareness of what has gone on with industry and the promotion of industry science by industry, and the formation of many regulations in industry by industry scientists. And I think all of those things are coming to the forefront of people's realization. And I think that will help drive the agenda forward. And again, I think that the most important thing is for people to realize that they are not being protected by anyone, and that they have the power and the wherewithal to protect themselves. So that's I think, the hope for the future.
Thank you so much, Margaret. I'm going to turn now to some of the questions in the Q&A box. We have a couple of questions along a similar line, asking, can you provide some guidelines for providers and for consumers of science to recognize research articles that are from predatory firms?
Maybe I'll start.
David, go for it.
Yeah,
Yes,
well, the
please.
first thing is the consulting firms. I mentioned 3 in my book, in my talk, and in my book there are some, but just in general to look at consulting firms, and then if you Google them, you could not necessarily see their in their own page. They won't say that they're predatory firms, but you can look at who their clients are. What I found is that the same companies, there are companies that are out there saying, pediatric lead exposure at low levels is no big deal, and they're the same people working, around PFAS. They're working around beryllium. You name the chemical. So, a little bit of research will get you there. It's unfortunate, but there are some journals that don't really push hard on this, and they'll list a scientist, but they won't say who paid for it. So obviously look to see who paid for the study. If the study is paid for, by the manufacturer of the product, that alone should, discount the evidence, because manufacturers don't want to pay for studies that harm their ability to sell their product. Often you'll see something that says, we work for this company, but they didn't pay for, or we work for the industry, but they didn't pay for the study. Of course, that's nonsense. The money is fungible. And I've seen that these firms, these predatory or mercenary firms, collect hundreds of thousands or millions of dollars in hourly billing for this work. So they could say, well, we're not billing for this work, but we're billing for other work. So generally look at the disclosures, look at the names of the companies. It's not perfect. And it would be great to put up a website with all these, with all these firms, but no one on our side has the strength to do that. I mean, we are outgunned and we're outspent, as you've heard.
Thank you. Here's a practical question. Is it possible to have these slides afterward? The answer is yes. There will be a resource page for this session, as there was for, and there are also resource pages for session 1 and session 2. You will get an email with a link to the resource page, and you'll be able to find recordings for the sessions and links to various resources that have been mentioned in all of the talks. So I hope you'll enjoy those resources and share them around. New question, David, we have the best regulations money can buy. How do we get the money out of regulations as well as legislation?
Well, this is the problem. I mean, obviously the first problem is Congress, and Congress likes the way this is, and Congress is paralyzed, and certainly industry has a much bigger voice there than not. But we also have to really insist that the regulation is created differently. That same set of issues, that same disclosure of conflicted scientists, of conflicted science, conflict of interest, which every biomedical magazine insists on, the government doesn't insist on when they issue regulations. And so a company can pay for comments to be put into the a federal docket without it ever being revealed who paid for them. So we have to keep raising these issues and keep saying, look, we cannot believe scientists who are paid by an industry who want a specific result of their studies. We need to have independent science. And there are examples of that. They're not perfect, but they're certainly good ones. I mean, in Cambridge, actually, the Health Effects Institute, which is funded jointly originally by the motor industry and the EPA, has done a number of really excellent studies, and that government involvement really does insulate it. So when, for example, these diesel studies, the fossil fuel industry said, no, they're wrong. There was an agreement that the Health Effects Institute would actually evaluate the study and say, is it credible? Can it be used to base regulation on? And they said, absolutely. And even though they're partially supported by industry, they're independent enough. So I think we have to push for those sort of new institutions to evaluate the toxic effects of chemicals.
Thank you. Here we have a comment in our Q&A saying, one example, Massachusetts has a toxic-free kids bill to require disclosure of toxic chemicals in children's products. Industry got to legislators, and this bill has been changed to just cover children's toys instead of the wide variety of children's exposures in children's products. And bill provisions would require elimination of toxic chemicals were eliminated. Clean Water Massachusetts is trying to reverse this weakening, and we need doctors to weigh in. This would be so powerful. Phil, I wonder if you want to comment on that.
I'd love to. First of all, this watering down of the regulations that you described speaks to the power of the chemical industry, the power of the lobby on Beacon Hill, and at a deeper level, it speaks to short-term thinking that's motivated by greed, that doesn't care about the health of children. I'm sorry to put it bluntly, but that's really what it boils down to. I'm at Boston College now. I'm surrounded by Jesuits, and they're not uncomfortable speaking about good and evil, and this is certainly not good. It also speaks to, it reminds us who are in the health professions, physicians, nurses, toxicologists, public health professionals, that we have a powerful voice. Ruthann spoke to this. We're trusted voices in society. One of my favorite examples, which comes right here from Massachusetts, traces back now some 40 or 50 years to the seminal work of Dr. Bernard Lown, who was a renowned cardiologist at the Brigham. And Dr. Lown and a group of his colleagues got together at that time. They were scared to death of the threat of nuclear war with the Soviet Union and the United States armed to the teeth and pointing missiles at each other. And what they did was that they assembled a group of health professionals, mainly docs, in the United States, in the former Soviet Union. They formed an organization called the International Physicians Against the Proliferation of Nuclear War, IPPNW. They were instrumental in getting the nuclear reduction treaties passed back in that age. They were awarded the Nobel Peace Prize for their work. I'm not saying that we docs in the trenches are going to get the Nobel Peace Prize for our work, but we do have the opportunity to speak out and to make change in society, to buttonhole our legislators. Now, legislators will listen, especially if you catch them in their home office in Attleboro or Springfield or Westboro. It's harder to get them on Beacon Hill. They're running around like crazy. But catch them at home and tell them they have to act to protect children. That protecting children's health is not a blue thing or a red thing. It's not a Republican thing or a Democratic thing. It's everybody's children, and they got to do the right thing. This is just a matter of doing the right thing.
Thank you. And I noticed in session 2 that Dr. David Christiani mentioned the Mass Medical Society as a vehicle for this kind of approach, joining with other physicians to have influence together.
Yeah, the Mass Medical Society has become increasingly involved, and I applaud them for that. It's good work.
Question for Ruthann. Some of the pollutants emitted by fossil fuel are carcinogens. How can we direct climate change policy to be centered in health and equity For example, focusing on emission reduction instead of carbon capture that increase pollution in EJ communities, environmental justice communities, or cap and trade?
Wow. I'm not an expert on fossil fuels, but I certainly know from all the research we've done on, on breast cancer, and that air pollution causes, lung cancer, but many other cancers as well. And breast cancer is also important. And I think, as we've talked about before, there's systematic inequities that cause unequal distributions of risk and exposure to these pollutants. And that was covered really, really well in session 2, also with some great maps showing unequal distribution of risk and those pollutants. And I strongly support that as we work to reduce fossil fuels, that we focus on first reducing exposure to communities that are bearing the greatest brunt of the exposures. Thanks.
Thank you, Ruthann. A new question for David. Dr. Michaels raises an important point about who should pay for research on health effects associated with chemical exposures. I'm curious if he has thoughts on better models for scientific advisory boards, which are often comprised of scientists volunteering their time to review evidence and research. These scientists need to spend hours of time reviewing research articles and often have to quickly develop an expertise to be on par with industry-funded toxicologists paid to attend the open meetings. Such a problem. You're on mute.
Boy, that is a huge problem, not me being on mute, but the problem raised by these questioners. This question. I've been on many advisory panels. I've had 2 advisory panels, actually more than that, report to me. And people who are very busy, who have careers, whose institutions don't necessarily support them to do that, have great difficulty participating. And obviously, again, if you have a panel that allows conflicted scientists who are paid by their employer, who want to see a certain outcome, they can spend as much time as they need to and get all the support to do that. Well, we need a better system. The scientific advice is fundamental to protecting the American public. Public health agencies, medical agencies all have scientific advisory boards that we rely on. The FDA relies on them for obvious reasons. The CDC does. And some of the questions they're asked are so important and so complex that I think what we need to do is, find excellent scientists who have great integrity, who have great training, who maybe don't know anything about an issue at all, and be willing to support them to dive into this issue, to really understand what's going on, to give the government the best advice, because we can't rely on people who the mix of people who either have support of their employer, who want a certain outcome, or who have to carve time out to do this because it's one of the many things that they do, without giving it enough time to be able to weigh in at the level that they need. So there are no easy answers, but it's a problem that often isn't acknowledged. So I'm really glad you raised that, and that's one thing we ought to be thinking about.
Yes, very, very important. Here's a comment from Wisconsin. In Wisconsin, we formed a group of medical practitioners that does education and advocacy, the Wisconsin Environmental Health Network. We do teaching and advocacy. We are not researchers, but people listen to us. And that is so key. We've developed quite a bit of influence. So thank you for adding that note. And I think we'll take one last question. How can environmental health researchers best translate their research findings into formats and venues that will reach clinicians and other medical professionals? Margaret, do you want to take that one, and then Phil, and then we're going to need to close our conversation.
Well, I think that those of us who feel strongly about this issue have to continue knocking on doors and writing articles and participating in forums of this kind. I don't know how else we can do this. I mean, I think it might be important to develop some teaching modules for the public and for public health professionals, and try to use that as a mechanism for translating the important recent results in science to the general public. But I think that's a key issue in every field where you want to educate the public about a complex issue.
Phil, do you have a quick word to add?
First, I would absolutely second what Margaret just said. All of us in the professions have to work to educate our sisters and brothers about these issues. There's very little education about toxic chemicals, about chemical carcinogens in medical schools or nursing schools or residency programs. So education is the base. I also think we have to get a little bit outside our comfort zone. We in addition to educating within the professions, which we do all the time, we feel comfortable doing it. We've got to go outside. We've got to, as I said a few minutes ago, we've got to speak to lawmakers. We've got to point out to policymakers that these issues of whether or not a certain unpronounceable chemical is going to be allowed in a children's toy, those aren't just technical issues. They're not just environmental issues. They're human health issues, and they have consequences for health and disease in children. And then finally, this is a big lift, but if we could persuade our lawmakers in Congress to just double the relatively small percentage of the global cancer budget that goes to prevention with NCI, that would be a huge difference for the prevention effort, and in no way would derail the 95% or 97% of the cancer budget that goes today into clinical trials and cancer treatment.
I hear you on that point. Amy, 1 minute?
Yeah, briefly, I just wanted to second what Phil was saying, that clinicians have such a powerful voice, not just in going to local offices to reach legislators, but follow that with op-eds that you sign in local papers, in their hometown papers. They'll pay attention. Letters to the editor, respond, let them know what you think. You're the experts. They want to hear from you. Thanks.
Great ideas. Gary, 1 minute.
And then just one more thing, I don't want the audience to go away thinking that NCI does not care about the environment and cancer. These new cohorts are being supported at close to $60 million over a 5-year period. So that's a huge investment for NCI with these cancer cohorts. We are really interested in research in the environment and cancer, and we'd love to talk to you about your ideas. So if you have some, please give us a call. Glad to have those discussions.
Thank you, Gary. And thank you all. I hope this conversation will inform and energize new directions that each of us can take to create a healthier world where we're actively reducing exposures to cancer-causing chemicals. If any of you wish to claim continuing medical education or nursing professional development credits for this session, you must complete an evaluation. The evaluation will be available in 3 business days, and you will get a reminder email. Even if you're not claiming credits, please complete the evaluation and give us your feedback. This is an innovative session, and we would like to know your thoughts about it. You'll receive a certificate of participation. And now to close our forum series, I am delighted to introduce David Reed, Vice President of Medical Oncology at Dana-Farber Cancer Institute. Thank you, David, for your leadership in making this forum a reality. It represents a major step forward in integrating environmental science into medicine. I hope other cancer centers will follow your lead.
Thank you so much, Julia. And in closing this third and final session of the Cancer and Environment Forum, I would like to thank the organizers, speakers, panelists from all the sessions. I'd also like to thank all of you who attended 1, 2, or 3 of these sessions. In creating this forum, we recognize that we have taken you down a path that is beyond what you may normally engage in with regard to cancer and prevention. As clinicians, researchers, public health practitioners, you are on the leading edge of integrating these environmental, chemicals, pollution issues into your work. For the clinicians, we hope these forums have provided you with more information to answer the complex questions that you may receive from patients about these issues. People like you and institutions like the Dana-Farber and other cancer centers across the country are key voices in elevating attention to these issues and among the important social determinants of health. Please know that I personally take this seriously, Dana-Farber takes these seriously, and we realize we need to do more. So thank you all for your participation. Have a good day. And as Julia reminded us, please fill out the surveys. We want to do better next time. Thank you.